And talking about jackpot, here's Nate Anderson. And Nate is another one of our Rocky Mountain Research Station scientists. Nate is more on the forest resources and economic side. Here come out the glasses, guys. He's conducted biomass and biochar research since 2009. Lists several projects here. Hopefully you'll get into it a little bit, but he's got his, yeah. So Nate, I could tell everybody about your studies and so on, but we know you're one of our researchers. And so we're going to get into the environment, the economics of it, because, you know, how do we make this practical is using the economics. And so it's going to be quite a job, I think, to find what is that sweet spot that's the perfect thing for forest management and break even. And I don't know if that sets you up or not, but Nate, you're up.
That's great. Thanks very much for the setup, Chris. And thanks so much for all the hard work you and others and Michael and all the extension services have put into this workshop. It's been great working with you. So thanks for that. Earlier versions of the agenda had Mike Lester, the Colorado State Forester, speaking mostly about the social costs of wildfire. So that would be something that's well known to a lot of people who live in the Western United States. The scale of wildfire risks to communities, burning homes, infrastructure, smoke and smoke inhalation and the health effects of smoke and the scale of that problem in terms of social cost. Mike couldn't be with us today, so I'm gonna fill in, and I'm going to talk about many of those same issues, but from a non-market valuation standpoint. So I'm going to look at forest restoration, fire risk, smoke, and renewable energy from a non-market valuation standpoint in the context of fuel treatment for forest restoration, particularly in the Western United States. So it's a little bit different, but hopefully good information. And I'm going to tie it very directly to biochar, as you'll see. Again, my name is Nate Anderson. I'm a research forester with the Rocky Mountain Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. I'm based in Missoula, Montana, and we have facilities spread all around the Rocky Mountain West. I'm based in Missoula. So I'll give you a little bit of background. I know many people on this workshop are from the Southwest, so know the main issues, but one of the great things about the webinar environment is that there may be people dialing in from all over the country or all over the world. So welcome, and I will provide enough background to get you up to speed on the current conditions in many of our Western forests, some of our management goals and objectives, especially from a public land management agency standpoint, the challenges that we face, and then I want to talk a little bit about complete valuation of these fuel treatments for forest restoration that include a lot of non-market values, specifically with some opportunities for biochar. And the Venn diagram of what Debbie was talking about with some of the ecosystem services associated with biochar is just a perfect lead-in. And we'll talk more about ecosystem services. And then I'll leave you with some conclusions. So before I do that, I just want to acknowledge a lot of the work you'll see discussed today was the result of some pretty deep partnerships between universities, states, NGOs, and industry partners. We've had a lot of support from the USDA through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture on a bunch of different projects, and from the U.S. Forest Service. And I definitely want to thank my co-author, Robert Campbell, who's he's an energy economist now, but was a postdoc and a graduate student with me for a long time. So thanks to everybody who's been involved in this work. So current ecological conditions, this is that background. Many of you are familiar with the challenges, but let's do a quick rundown. We have many millions of acres of forest that have densely overstocked conditions, an increase in shade tolerant species in the understory, which has increased fuel loads, and a lot of different interacting forest health problems. So we have drought stress in many places, insects and disease. Here's some forests that have been negatively impacted by the native mountain pine beetle damage. And from a tree's perspective, this translates to high mortality and low vigor. And at the scales we're talking about, this is a really big forest management challenge. And we're also facing conditions in terms of our management that are challenging. So we know these forests in their current state are prone to large and severe wildfires. This is a story that you're all familiar with. We have a lot of development in the wildland urban interface. People love the amenities that forests bring and love being close to forests, but that presents challenges. Climate change is making things worse in many areas. And this all kind of combines to produce a situation where the services, ecosystem services that we expect from our forests are at risk in many places. From an agency standpoint, we're also faced with the escalating costs of wildfire management, and that leaves fewer resources for silviculture and fuel treatment and everything else we do as an agency. In a forest degradation context, we know that a lot of this is due to a less resilient forest structure and forest composition. And when we experience these large-scale disturbances, we have things like regeneration failure and other undesirable changes, maybe invasive species and other changes following large-scale disturbances. And many of you are familiar with the story that goes along with this in terms of aggressive fire suppression over many decades, certain grazing and logging practices, insects and disease, and superimposed over all of this, climate change. So this is a pretty challenging context for us. And our management goals, thinking at a very high level, not diving into any particular ecosystem, our management goals in a lot of these situations is forest restoration, moving these forests from their current state into some condition where they're more resilient to fire and other disturbances. They have higher drought resilience under climate change, more heterogeneity within the range of variation at the stand level, at the forest level, at the landscape level, so at these different scales. Restoring burned areas and trying to avoid transition from a forested state to a non-forested state that's brought about by severe wildfire. And really driving this point home that we're trying to protect ecosystem function first and foremost, so especially soil processes, soil conservation, watershed function, hydrology, biodiversity, and deliver all the ecosystem services that we expect from our forests. So certainly timber and biomass, but water, recreation. I'll talk more about these in a moment. So no question, accomplishing these goals and objectives presents huge operational challenges on the ground. Compared to what we're used to with commercial timber operations or private land management for timber, a lot of the silvicultural prescriptions that we use to accomplish these objectives are difficult to implement, often because they have complex residual stand conditions. They can have high upfront costs, lower product values in terms of the removals of biomass and small diameter logs and dead and dying material, limited markets for those products in a lot of places, and narrower, I use the word profit margins here, but we can think about this in terms of costly treatment on the landscape. They also have higher risk to personnel and property in some situations, and what I'm going to talk about mostly today is they have complex valuation. And we want to be thinking about the value of fuel treatments, I think, in a more detailed way than we would normally look at a timber sale. So Debbie used this term a lot in her talk, ecosystem services, and particularly ecosystem services associated with biochar and biochar application. We could spend a whole workshop on this, but I just want to highlight when we think about provisioning ecosystem services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services. A big advantage of biochar is we can see that it cuts across a lot of these different things. So we can think about using timber and biomass in an economic context to make biochar as a provisioning service. Often biochar systems are associated with renewable energy and heat and power and potentially even liquid fuels. So we have these provisioning services. And at the same time, Debbie talked a lot about supporting services in terms of soil health, soil protection, nutrient cycling, soil formation, organic matter in the soil, those supporting services. Regulating services, biochar is high on the list in terms of carbon sequestration, climate change mitigation, climate regulation, those sorts of things. And even some of these others. I won't go into all of them. And then cultural services, all of this enhances our ability to deliver the types of cultural and recreational and science and education experiences that we expect. So biochar is great in this space. The problem is, from an economic standpoint, is that we have kind of a market failure in terms of positive externalities associated with fuel treatment and potential downstream uses of biomass, like production of biochar. And so what that means is many of the values, we're explicitly prescribing these silvicultural treatments across this broad spectrum of ecosystem services and ecosystem values, but only a very few of those make it into the financial analysis. So we're not expressing a lot of these values in market prices. And there's an extensive body of economics research devoted to doing this, to the valuation of non-market ecosystem goods and services. I think that approach is appreciated at high level management planning at the forest scale, for example, how we look at forests in our society in 2021. But very poorly integrated into project scale planning, kind of the boots on the ground, granular level. And so the purpose of what I'm going to show you over the next few slides is how do we start integrating this non-market valuation in a quantitative way that's scientifically rigorous and kind of proven to work, kind of operationalizing this type of approach. One of the solutions that we've looked at in the Rocky Mountain Research Station is downscaling some of the techno-economic analysis associated with projects and connecting it directly to valuation of ecosystem services and benefits that are currently non-market associated with fuel treatments, to move from the black and white picture on the left to the color picture on the right, where we get more benefits and protect those ecosystem services. So I will not go into much detail on the methods, except to tell you that we're basically taking a lot of field research, taking traditional financial analysis and techno-economic analysis and non-market valuation techniques, and kind of smashing them to get together in a simulation-based approach where we can look at the costs and benefits of different projects. We can compare alternative scenarios, things like that. I won't talk much about the methods, but you can contact me if you want to know more. What I'm going to show you is the results of a case study where we're looking at fuel treatment in the Colorado wildland-urban interface, comparing alternative actions with and without bioenergy. And so the pictures on the left include the top picture, which is business as usual, status quo, no action. Then we can think of implementing a fuel treatment where we pile burn, and Debbie talked a lot about pile burning and the reasons we do it, but also the negative impacts from that. And then also, what if instead of pile burning, we have some sort of project that uses that biomass? In this case, I'm going to show you a power plant, a 10 megawatt power plant, but we could be talking about a biochar project or a constellation of clusters like Tony talked about of businesses that use this material. I want to point out that there's no timber product revenue involved here. What I'm going to show you does not depend on timber product revenue. We wanted it to be timber neutral in terms of saw log removal or higher value products. We wanted to start with a pretty simple project that didn't complicate it with timber revenue. So here we go. I'm going to show you some results from a project that's an 11 megawatt power plant, electricity only, no timber revenue. And really every year to fuel this plant, we're talking about fuel treatment on 17,000 acres, roughly, over a 20-year period. And for market values, when we're talking about market costs associated with this project, we can get pretty good numbers for those, right? We can find numbers for thinning costs, for what it costs us to pile burn, what it costs to move ground and process material to some facility like a power plant. Broadcast burning has a cost associated with it. Biopower, it obviously costs money to build a plant. So these are all the market costs. And then we have electricity revenue at the end of the day. But what about all these non-market things? This is really where the rubber hits the road. There's tons of ecosystem services and tons of non-market benefits that we might be able to include here. We picked 4, okay? These are the 4. Reduced risk of wildfire. That is a huge reason why we implement these treatments, so we want to include that one. Improved air quality. This is one that impacts people directly, so it's really important to look at that one. Healthier forests. I talked about more resilient forests, resilient to large-scale disturbance. Man, we want to quantify that. And then renewable energy is something that a lot of people can appreciate and understand compared to conventional fossil fuel energy. There are a lot of other things we could have included here. We didn't include carbon and climate benefits. We didn't include rural development benefits. There were a bunch of reasons why we focused on these 4, and I encourage you to read this paper if you want to know all of those reasons. But the main point is we picked these 4 things, and then we want to quantify, even though these are non-market, the public's willingness to pay for these things. How much would the public actually be willing to pay for these? In our case, we used something called a choice modeling experiment, where people, are given these different sets of choices that they have to go through, and it's kind of fun to do. And it's focused on those 4 and their monthly energy bill, and we can use some statistics to derive what their willingness to pay would be for these different benefits. I promise you, I will link all of this to Biochar in just a few slides, so bear with me. We can use that choice modeling experiment to quantify non-market values in these 4 categories at the state level. So this is big scale. And when we think about household willingness to pay for improved air quality, we looked at, how much houses were willing to pay for less severe poor air quality days. You can look up the definitions in that paper I showed you. Same thing, like 1 less wildfire per year. These were big wildfires we're quantifying, not small ones, but how much would a household be willing to pay for 1 less severe wildfire, renewable energy, forest health? And then we can downscale those to the project scale. So you can take those values, you can look at this 20-year project, 17,000 acres a year, and kind of downscale those to get some value for this. Now look at forest health. People not really willing to pay that much for forest health, 4/1000ths of a dollar per acre, right? But when you aggregate that across the population, across the state, across the acres, it's not so small. So using this technique, we can compare the kind of pure financial transaction of pile burning for fuel treatment, which is the top left, scenario A. Let's look at pile burning with no non-market values. That's going to cost us over 20 years at 17,000 acres a year, $275 million. Now this is the total cost all in, and you can read the papers if you want the gory details on this. But boy, that's a huge number. We should make decisions based on that number, right? Sometimes we have to. We have a budget. It's real cost, so that's an important number. But what if we got that material, instead of pile burning it, to the right, the top right, where we have a bioenergy scenario? If we can get that material to a facility where it is where it's used for something like electricity or biochar or some other product that improves our economics quite a bit. We think of the net present value of the project as improving to a negative 178 cost, so $178 million cost. In panel C, we see the pile burn scenario. What if we include non-market values? So we actually account for the benefits that are driving some of the prescriptions. Well, it improves quite a bit to $116 million cost. And then if we do both the bioenergy and non-market values, we end up at this 25 million number, right? So we're thinking about this in terms of just these four really restructure how you're thinking about fuel treatment on the landscape and what benefits you're deriving and what the costs are. We could add other ecosystem services, carbon benefits, and I want to remind you that this does not include timber value. So let's talk about biochar. I'm going to skip this slide with the time I have. So let's talk about biochar. So circling back to ecosystem services, we've already established that the public has a certain level of willingness to pay, positive willingness to pay for improvements in air quality, lower likelihood of wildfire, forest health, renewable energy. There's a positive willingness to pay for these benefits. And if we incorporate that into our calculations and our decision making, it's important. One great thing for biochar is this opportunity to potentially cut across these. So we have slash and wood waste disposal with less smoke. People like that. They like less poor air quality days in their air shed. And this applies to the kind of forward operating environment where we're using potentially a char boss or something like that. But it also applies if we remove the material and get it to a power plant. The same air quality benefits apply. Our feedstock that we're using is tied to benefits reducing wildfire risks, so we get all the benefits from that, which is great. Protection of homes and communities, infrastructure and ecosystem services. Renewable energy, a lot of biochar conversion systems involve either heat capture, potentially heat and power, and even some large scale systems, potentially a liquid fuel product. And so we can think about biochar being able to tap into people's willingness to pay for renewable energy systems. And then forest health. We have both the feedstock benefits tied to forest restoration that we see in terms of forest health. And then if we can get that biochar in forest soils, we think about burned area recovery, drought resilience, site and road rehabilitation, invasive species control, other soil benefits. So it's really a nice sandbox to be playing in here. Back to the economics just for a moment. If we want to shift this into positive value category, that is where we're actually generating a profit. We can think about that break-even price as being just $172 per acre for timber or biomass or biochar systems associated with that, or higher energy prices, or some constellation of additional market benefits that might be able to drive that distribution to the right and really capture the most value. I haven't even talked about suppression cost savings, so wildfire suppression cost savings, greenhouse gas and climate benefits. Haven't even talked about it. It's not included here, and so we're still in a box where we're talking about real cash transactions with timber and biomass and power prices. So we can talk more about these other things later. I want to just leave you with these conclusions. Keep an eye on my time here. Hopefully this kind of crash course in non-market valuation, at least one technique of non-market valuation, has given you the idea that this is a lot richer information for decision making than just what's the balance sheet in terms of the financial costs at the end of the day. And fuel treatments tend to be undervalued when they're evaluated purely based on financial outcomes. And we can think of that as a kind of market failure that may drive inefficient decision making, because we're not valuing the reason we're doing these treatments isn't just to harvest biomass or harvest timber. There's all these other things, and we can value those explicitly. And then I really, really want to hammer this home is biochar has a really exciting role to play in expanding the pace and scale of fuel treatment to meet our wildfire risk management goals. And it has a role to play in slash and smoke management, renewable energy, soil benefits, carbon sequestration. And I think that's one of the reasons why people get so excited about it. I'll leave you with my contact information. Feel free to contact me. And I'll also let you know tomorrow morning, I'll be talking about biochar enterprise and biochar conversion technologies from a more traditional financial standpoint. And so it's really nice to lead in today with the non-market valuation, the ecosystem services, and all these land management aspects, because I think in that context, tomorrow's discussion on the finances of biochar projects will be set up pretty nicely. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back over to Chris.
Excellent work. Thank you so much, Nate.